Shalom, everyone. Glad you could make it. It's a beautiful Wednesday night here in Texas. I don't know what it's like where you're at, but it's absolutely gorgeous down here. Been gorgeous all day long. But anyway, we're going to be in the first chapters of the book of Leviticus. But before we get into that, I just want to go through some trivia that I want to talk about. And the first piece of trivia is actually today is the last day of Adar, the last day of joy. And tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, or the first day of Nisan. And in that, we move from joy to what they believe is rectification and redemption. That's what's supposed to come in this month. And so it's a different way of looking at things, I guess. It was also this month, or at about this same time, that Moses in Exodus chapter 12 was told that they were going to move to the lunar calendar, and that he was supposed to begin to teach the others about the new moon and when a new moon occurs and what it looks like. And so he began the process of switching to the lunar calendar on this day. So we have several things going on, and the mitzvah for the calendar is actually the first mitzvah that the Jews actually have. It's the first one given to them. Moses had trouble recognizing what God meant by the first moon, or the first slice of the moon. So God had to pre-show him what it would look like, so that when it actually did come, he could explain it to the rest of the Sanhedrin, who would eventually take over the process of identifying the first slice of the moon, or the beginning of a month. And by doing that, we also created the need for two witnesses who would come to the Sanhedrin to allow them to know that this had happened, so that they could begin to put fires on all of the mountains in the areas, so that everyone would be notified that this was the beginning of the next month. There was another thing that was going on. It's also in the book of, it's in my Talmud, and I don't know if you've ever seen a Talmud. This is a Talmud. It's one of the 72 books that were put together by the Great Assembly. And in putting the book together, it's a combination of mitzvahs, or Mishnah, and Gemara. It's a combination of the laws and a combination of those things that go discussed by the laws. Well, in Rosh Hashanah, chapter 10a, or actually 10b and 11a, there's a whole section that deals with the first day of the month. It says it in this particular area that when did the creation actually occur? For some, Rabbi Eliezer was the one who was the leader of this, believed that the first day, Tishrei 1, was actually the beginning of creation. Now, Tishrei 1, in order to be the beginning of creation, was actually the sixth day of creation, because they said, as Eliezer said, this is the day in which Adam was created, so therefore this is the first day, when in actuality, according to Genesis, it's the sixth day. They asked him for proof. How can you prove that this is the first day? And he says, well, simply look at the scriptures. On this day, the fields are ripe, trees are full, blossoms are starting, but also fruit is actually being grown. So Tishrei 1 is the beginning, and that's when Rosh Hashanah is, and that's what it's about. Rabbi Joshua came to the conclusion, no, you're not right. The first day actually was the day of Nisan. And I asked the question again, why did they think it was Nisan? And he would point out the fact that there's deeper understanding here. First, you have to understand the fact that it's not about the fields, it's about the animals. You see, in the spring, or in Nisan, that's the season of animals copulating and bearing children. So he says this has to be the first of the month. This has to be the year. Over and over again, then they argued back and forth as to which was greater, which one held the most. Nothing was ever decided, but you had 2 days now that you can recognize. So remember, we went from a calendar that was a solar calendar with Tishri 1 being the head of the year to now here in Exodus, from Exodus 12 on, we're now beginning the calendar starting on Nisan. Now, I want you to turn in your Bibles to Exodus, the last chapter. And I want to start there for a second. It's Exodus chapter 40, and I want you to look at the first verse. Actually, it's the first couple of verses. It begins by saying, Hashem spoke to Moses, saying, on the day of the first new moon, on the first day of the month, you shall erect the tabernacle, the tent of meetings, and there shall place the ark. And he goes through the list of all the equipment that's going to be put into that ark at that point in time. Go down to verse 17. It says, it was in the first month of the second year of the first month of that the tabernacle was erected. And Moses erected the tabernacle. He put it down in the sockets and he placed it in its planks and he inserted the bars and he erected the pillars. Well, he did that actually for 7 days. He demonstrated how the tabernacle was to be put together, how it fit, how everything went, where all the positions of all the furnishings were, where the altar would be, where the laver would be. Everything was identified and shown to the Levites, because the Levites would basically be running that portion of it. He also went into the tabernacle itself and he laid out where the holy place, the articles of the menorah and the altar of incense and the shewbread, and then even into the inner where you had the Ark of the Covenant. He went through that process for multiple days. Now, for many, their understanding is that he began this process on the 23rd day of the month of Adar. Now, there's some disagreement on that. It's not something that's easily set in stone. But I say that because we're going to get into something that's going to be, well, interesting in the sense of occurrences and when things actually happen. So I want you now to turn to the first part of Leviticus, and we're going to go through a first couple of verses. Now again, he begins by saying, he called to Moses, and Hashem spoke to him from the tent of meeting and saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when a man, now the word man here is not ish, which is the normal expression. The word man here is Adam. Adam is universal, meaning that it's not only the Jew, but he's speaking to all. Now, this poses a problem because eventually there's going to say that the Gentiles can't offer offerings at the tabernacle or at the temple. They had to use the altar that was across the hill on Mount of Olives. But at this point in time, that's what the article says. So it says, so the man who is among them brings an offering. The concept of bringing is voluntary. So what we're going to be talking about are voluntary offerings. There is nothing demanded at this point. This is all voluntary. Now, there are some offerings that are mandated. There's the offerings that are mandated for the high priest on Rosh Hashanah. There's the offerings of the morning and the evening oblation. There are lots of those kinds of, but what we're going to be talking about are those offerings that are voluntary. And eventually we're going to get into talking about the burnt offering and the sin offering, because those are the two that pertain to us, or would mostly pertain to us. So I wanted to give you the heads up. Now, if we go back to the beginning, and it says the first word we know is the word Vayikra, which means, and he called. Now, again, if you looked at the Hebrew side, you recognize that there's a small aleph. Many discussions have happened over that letter. The concept of that letter speaks of what we say as humility. And the fact that it is small is the fact that one who is humble is small. Notice to whom the article, or to whom he calls. So God is calling specifically to one man. And that one man that he's calling to is Moses. So he's calling to the most humble of men at that point in time. So that's the small aleph. Now, if you went to a Torah scroll, and it's not in my art scroll, but in the Torah scroll, 1 Chronicles 1:1, the first name on there is Adam. On there, the aleph is enlarged, just like it's enlarged in Bereshit. So this is to recognize aleph as one. The first one was Adam, and that's why he's enlarged. But Moses is shrunk, his is smaller. Now, in Hebrew, the fact that we're beginning to talk about the fact he called to Moses, and we begin to go through this whole process of talking about Moses, we have to understand when he starts talking to Moses. Now, he began the whole process of putting together the tabernacle 7 days before, on the 23rd of Adar. This is the first day of the new month, or the 8th day. The 8th day is always assigned to the idea of a beginning, something new. So we're beginning something new here in this particular section. Now, as we go through this, please understand that Vayikra is not in chronological order. There are things that are out of place or out of whack. And talking with Ross just tonight, there's disagreement between Ross and Rambam as to the order of events. And that's not uncommon. Rashi had a different understanding. Rashi and Rambam do not always agree, nor does Rambam agree with Ramban. Lots of people have different opinions as to what day, when it's going to happen. Now, in this particular case, they begin by saying that this is the first day of the actual entering into the tabernacle. Now, remember, Moses could not get into the tabernacle. Nobody could. Why? Because the cloud had descended and the presence of God was so strong, nobody could get near the entrance into the tabernacle itself. No one. Moses had to wait to be called. And that's why he begins with the idea, and he called to Moses. He calls him into the tent. Do you remember the last time Moses was called and there was a cloud involved? Do you remember that? Mount Sinai. Remember, the cloud descends on the mountain. The cloud is there. He begins to teach them the Ten Commandments. They can't handle just the volume of his voice. So they simply send Moses up. So Moses was called up. Now the same thing is happening again. Moses is being called into instead of up. But the concept is two different things. One thing I want you to understand is when God was talking to Israel at Mount Sinai, remember what had been going on. The people had begun to be healed. There was a constant change because people became of one heart and one mind. Everything was going back to that first day in the Garden of Eden. Everything would have returned. Had it gone perfectly well, there would have been no such thing as Deuteronomy and all the rest of them, because it would have all been settled out. That would have happened. You and I would not be here. But we are here, so it didn't work, obviously. What prevented it from working? The golden calf. That golden calf was the cause for God changing and no longer allowing them to return to that first day, the first Adam. Now we're going into a second. And last week I started to talk with you about, I think I started talking with you about the tent. I know I talked about it on Thursday morning, so let me go through it again. We're now moving from a place where everything was no longer going to be perfect as in Eden. Man came down with a second set of tablets. Now here, at this point, they're starting over again. But they're starting over with a tent. Now, this tent was to remind the people of marriage. This is about God marrying Israel. This is also about reminding them of where they were going back to. They were not going back to Eden at this point. They're going back as far as the patriarchs. And so God is now starting up again in the idea of the patriarchs. Understand this. Remember, I talked about Sarah's tent, I think. It's hard to remember what I've taught and what I said on Thursday. But anyway, here goes. Sarah's tent is very significant. First off, it was a marriage tent. It was the tent that she lived in. She had three qualities that tent had that no other tent had. And it was relit when Isaac married Rebekah. The first quality was her ability to make bread. Now, the bread that she made was different than everybody else's bread. Evidently, she had a better formula. And in her formula, the bread always stayed warm. In her formula, when you ate the bread, you were full. You didn't need anything else to eat. The second thing that was about her tent was the fact that there was a light within her tent that was not found in any other tent. In fact, it stayed on all the time. It was a perennial light. It only went out when Sarah died. It relit when Rebekah moved into Sarah's tent. The third thing that I want to talk about is the fact that this, let me think again. This tent, what was my third point? I can't even remember. Let me think it through. Oh, well, it's going to come to me. But anyway, there's three things that were in common. So the tent, the tabernacle, was to remind them of the wedding tent, the tent of marriage. It was the bread was the showbread. The concept of the light was the menorah. That was the third. The candles, the cloud. Thank you very much, Cheyenne, your lifesaver. The cloud. The cloud was always over Sarah's tent. That was the third thing. So those were the three things that were in common. So Moses is now invited into the marriage tent. He goes in there for all of the people. Again, this is the idea of the ketubah. This is the idea of the wedding. He is going through the process. And so he now enters into that tent. That's what's going on at this particular point in time. So as he goes into the tent, he's invited in. He doesn't just go into the tent. That's the concept of Vayikra, Moshe. Moses was to come in because he was invited in. Now, the second thing that happened is not found here in the beginning, but according to Rambam, Rashi, and Ramban, this was the time in which two of Aaron's sons, Avihu and Nadav, came into the tent and brought strange fire before the Lord. Evidently, Moses had walked out and they had moved in and they had put strange fire before the Lord, and we know that they died. And that two of their cousins, Aaron's brother's sons, came into the tent to remove them from the tent. That was the second thing that happened. Now, on the outside, they were also lighting the morning offering, the morning oblation, because it was about 9 o'clock. So the timing would have been about then. That's not listed in here. The fourth thing that happened that day was the fact that there was the first of the offerings brought by the brothers. It was on that day that Nachshon, from the tribe of Judah, brought in his list, and that'll go into the book of Numbers, and we'll get a list of all the things that were given in the book of Numbers and go through that, which is rather fascinating in the sense that all 12 brothers brought exactly the same items. Each one worked separately, but they all offered the exact same thing. So that was also going on at this particular point in time. So the tent was very, very busy. There was a lot of activity that went on this particular day. It was a very, very strong day. But we also have to understand that there were several other things going on, and I can't lose our focus. First off, this book, in my opinion, is the hardest book for me to read and the most boring. The reason it's the hardest and the most boring is because it's not pointed at me. If we know the books by the name of Vayikra, he called. We know the name of this by the Latin name, which is Leviticus, which talks about the Levitical people. In the Jewish understanding, this book is called Torat, Kohanim. Torat is the Torah. Kohanim are the priests. So this is a book to the priests. And so a great deal of this Torah, of this book, deals with Levitical law. Now, I am a Goyim. I am not a Jew. In fact, during the early days, when the Torah was put together by the great sages in the Great Assembly, and they were beginning to assemble the Talmud and everything else, the sages said that it needed to be taught to all the children below the age of 12. This is the first book they were supposed to learn how to read. Can you imagine you sitting down with your mom or dad and practicing reading the book of Leviticus? What would you think as you were reading through that? How would you describe your understandings of the different offerings and all the things that went into that? How would you handle dealing with sarets, with leprosy? How would you deal with the ideas of alcoholism and drinking? Because that would be one of those things that was in there. All of those things are there. And imagine that you're giving it to your 3-year-old, your 4-year-old, your 5-year-old, because that's the first book you want them to learn. Now you ask the question, well, why on earth would they want them to learn that first? Why not do something easy like Genesis? Well, the answer is the fact that up until the age of their bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, they're innocents. And the innocent people should be reading the book that deals with innocence and remaining so. And so in the beginning, this book was the book that was to be taught. This is what they worked with. Today, that's not the same. When I went into a second grade class in Israel in Shiloh, they were just starting into their year, and the book that they were starting in was Genesis. And that's what they were reading, which was more in line with what my thinking was. But that's just because that's thinking in versus my understanding. Now, Nisan, again, the purpose of Nisan, or the effect of Nisan after 2 years, it's been 2 years now since they left under the 10 plagues. It's in the third year they're getting started. It's the idea of Gilah. Gilah is the idea of redemption. So we're beginning a month of redemption. It's also during this month of redemption, as time has gone on, that many of the rabbis say that this is the most appropriate time for the Messiah to come. That this is the time in which he will display himself, he will show himself. And so people are now, as we go through this, starting tomorrow, the people of Israel will be looking for their Messiah, looking for their Redeemer, the one who will end the complete exile. Now we know there's an exile from Egypt into Israel, but there's also an internal exile when we are trapped and caught in our own world of Yetzirah, our own world of sin, our own world of evil. So with the coming of the Messiah, this Gilah, this redemption will begin. Now others will tell you, no, it's going to be in Tishri. Can you see how Tishri and Nisan are the two most important months as you're going through this whole process? Tishri has the week where they do the B'nai Noach section, the second Parsha. The second Parsha deals with the 70 nations. The 70 nations deals with Gog and Magog. If you read Ezekiel 37 and 38, or 38 and 39, this is what you're reading about, is the battles between Gog and Magog versus Israel. The value of the letters for Gog and Magog is 70. So they say that the most appropriate time for the Messiah to come and take on his enemies will be during the month of Tishri. So both ideas are laid out for us. Both ideas are there. But my biggest hang-up with this whole thing is the idea of sacrifice. And I'm not alone. There were many sages that argued on my behalf way back when. You know, Leviticus, our first section, is going to be dealing with nothing but the sacrifices, the listing of them, the going through the meal offering and the salt, and all of those other things are going to be found here. But the question is, why are they taking on a sacrificial system? Why was it necessary to do that? Now, if you remember back at the mountain, had everything gone well, there wouldn't have been a tent. There wouldn't have been a need for a tent because Israel and God would have been one. So the tent would have been like in the Garden of Eden. They would have gone back to that original state. And we also know that there would have been no sacrifices. Adam's sacrifice came only after leaving the garden. And the question that I ask is, why did Adam sacrifice after he left the garden? What was his intention? What was his hope? What was his purpose in doing what he was doing? Now, if I were to think from God's point of view, first off, God doesn't eat. He doesn't taste. He does smell, evidently, because of the fact that it talks about God could smell the sweet fragrance of the, but really that's not what it was actually saying. So God's not a carnivore. He's not even a herbivore. God doesn't eat. Why was he interested in keeping this activity? Or was he not interested in this? This was for the people themselves. You see, the Rambam spent a lot of time talking about the historical time period in which Israel was coming out of Egypt. The nations of the world were all pagan. Remember, that was the thing that Abraham fought against. He was the only one who stood for the one God. Everyone else was already into multiple gods. But he stood for one. So now here we find ourselves in a situation as he's writing a guide to the perplexed. Now, the Guide to the Perplexed is a book that Rambam wrote, and he wrote it for this purpose. The Easter bunnies, the Christmas kids, those that only went to synagogue twice a year or 3 times a year. He wrote it to try to encourage them, to help them understand why they do all of the things that they do in the tabernacle or in the temple and now in the synagogue. What is it all about? That's what he was going to. You know, in the days in which they left Egypt, pageantry was everywhere when it came point in time for the honoring of a god. Sacrifices happened on those days. In fact, in Israel at that time, the Canaanites were sacrificing their children to the god of Moloch. There was also human sacrificing that was going on that was quite common. So God evidently knew that Israel had not rid itself of the idea of needing a sacrifice. So God began to develop a system that had purpose to it. It wasn't the pageantry of the other systems, because there was no great parades. There was the morning and evening offering. But the rest of those offerings were made by men coming by themselves to that place. But before the tabernacle was even finished, before the first temple was even dedicated, the first thing that had to be there was a mikveh. There had to be a mikveh before any construction. And the same is true today. For any synagogue, there has to be a mikveh before you have the synagogue. That is the first requirement. So water was the most important, dealing with that whole idea of regeneration, going through the process. The water was also for the blessing of the marriage. All of that came from that very beginning point. So as we're going through this understanding, note that the sacrifices and the process is going to be quite different. Notice also that even if you read those first 6 chapters, you still do not understand all the intricacies. Because you see, there's more than 100 laws that involve these sacrifices and involve the priests and what they can do and how they can do it. Everything is tied up in a procedure, a way of doing things. So they have developed this system. The system no longer is functioning. But note, every day, the Jewish people who are Orthodox pray that the temple can be restored, that sacrifices can begin again. Now we say they must be crazy. Why does he need to do that? Well, some people have suggested, well, he's not going to sacrifice animals anymore, it'll be holograms, and so nothing will die. But that's not the point of the sacrifice. The point of the sacrifice is to change the person. When you pray in earnestness, you are praying to be changed, to draw closer to God. Now, the word for sacrifice in Hebrew is the word korban. Korban comes from a root word. The word is karev. Karev means to draw near. So when you offer an offering on the altar, your purpose in doing so was for yourself to personally draw nearer to God. You wanted to come closer to him. You see, the other was the opposite would have been to not draw closer to God, but to go away from God, and that would have been karet. So you're attempting to draw closer to God. Now, in this time of drawing closer to God, you now find yourself dealing with life differently. It's no longer about Vayikra, which means by accident or to come upon something, but it's by Vayikra, the idea of being called to this particular idea. Rashi said that every single time God called to Moses, he said his name. Rambam says, no, that didn't happen. He said it was not about his name anywhere but here and at Mount Sinai. Now, there are other places where he does call himself by name, call Moses by name, but they're few, not every time. Now, Moses needed permission to enter into the tabernacle. He needed permission to get past the cloud of glory, the presence of God, to get within that. But remind yourself, what was God's purpose in building the tabernacle? So he could dwell in it, or so he could dwell in them? He encouraged them by blocking in the beginning so that they knew he was real. But his reality was not to be inside of a building, although that was something that they could look upon. During the 40 years, they could see the cloud hanging over it or the fire at night. They could see that. That would give them courage. But that wasn't the purpose of it. The purpose was for God to dwell in them. That's what was going on. So the tabernacle was designed specifically after Abraham and Sarah, the first couple. You go from that particular point in time, understand that as it goes through time, the character called the Romans. There's a book, and I had it, but I can't remember what I did with it. I guess I should drink water. Excuse me. A book that was written by a Jew, a recent Jew. I mean, he's still alive and I can't remember it. And I know the book. He lists all of the phrases that the Romans used when describing the Jews. The Romans, Caesar was worried that the Romans were going to give up polytheism. They were going to give up the gods because they found more happening with the Jewish people, the Jewish family. The way they did things caused many Romans not to become Jews, but to move away from the Roman pagan gods and towards what we would call B'nai Noach, living by the 7 laws. That was what was going on. In fact, it got so bad that finally Rome simply said, you may no longer celebrate Sabbath, you may no longer have holidays, you may no longer do any offerings. You're banned. So as we go through then, I want you to look at the 2 offerings that I want to talk about. The first offering is going to be called the burnt offering. The burnt offering, it starts in verse number 10. It's an offering of one of the flock, from the sheep, from the goats, from the burnt offering, he shall be an unblemished male. A burnt offering was completely that. It was completely destroyed. It was completely given to God. Now, the question becomes, well, why did they offer, what was the point in bringing a sheep or whatever to God? Why did you want to do that? Well, there was a connection there. The connection came from the word karet. I talked about it a little bit, but the word karet itself actually means to sever one's soul. You see, the Jew understood that the further the way they moved from God, they reached a point where their soul was no longer with God. And so oftentimes they found themselves to the point where they said, I no longer feel God. I no longer understand. And it's at that point in time that they were attempting to draw closer to God and come back to him. And so they went through what's called the burnt offering. Now, the burnt offering, again, was the easiest to identify. But let me give you an example. Shabbat, comes every 7th day. What if you forgot it? I'm retired. I have a hard time telling what day of the week it is. Now, most of you probably are much better off at that than I am. But really, when you stop to think about it, outside of coming here on Wednesday nights and talking to others on Sunday mornings, those are the only 2 ways I know what day it is. Everything else is Saturday. And I treat it like Saturday, except when my wife gets on my case and says, you got to go do some work. Then that's the only time I get out of that. No, I do other things. But anyway, the concept was Shabbos. Now, if you forget Shabbos, that's not good, but is that punishable by separation from God? What if you decide that you're going to do something on Shabbos that you know you shouldn't be doing and you know it's Shabbos? There was a guy who was out picking up firewood on Shabbat. Remember that in the book of Numbers? His daughters eventually wanted to get his land for themselves. Checklefed was the name. Well, anyway, he went out and started picking up sticks. Now, he knew it was Shabbos, but he went and did that anyway because he knows that was work. That was something he could not do or should not do. But he did it. Now, he was brought before Moses, and Moses now had to figure out, what am I going to do? Moses hadn't been given instructions on how to handle those situations. So Moses left him, went into the tent of meeting, asked God. God told him, you're going to kill him. Came back out, spoke to the people. He's guilty. He should be stoned. And he was stoned that day in appliance of the laws of Shabbos and the laws of being away from God. Now, there are some articles that say that he was not trying to be ornery. He was not trying to disobey God. He did it because there were people that, well, I read it's because he was Kadosh Hashem, because the people weren't listening. Absolutely, Cheyenne, you're absolutely correct. Comes out of the volume called Kadoshim. The idea was they weren't listening. So he proved to them that this is what would happen, to bring them back into line. God took his life, but not because he deserved to be taken, but to give the example that he intended it to be. So the burnt offering was also known as an elevation offering. And it was called the elevation offering because in bringing it, you wanted to draw closer to God. That was your hope. That was what your intent was. So that's why you did it. Now, the second offering that they talk about is the offering that was called the sin offering. The sin offering was just that. You were coming before God because you had sinned. Now, imagine how many animals would have died if you were the person that had to bring an animal every time you had needed a sin offering. A sin offering was a large sin. It was one of those that was weighing you down. You could no longer deal with it. And so again, you brought an offering before the Lord at that point in time. You were psychologically attempting to draw closer to God again. Turn away from where you were and to turn back to God. That was the understanding. In all the offerings of the burnt or of the other, one would take the blood of the animal. Now, we recognize the blood of the animal as being the soul of the animal. It's the life of the animal. In the case of a burnt offering, blood from that animal would be spread on the four corners of the altar at the top. Because again, the concept is I want to draw closer. I want to olah. I want to elevate. In the case of the sin offering, one is humbling himself. And so he doesn't do it at the top of the altar, but the blood is sprayed or scattered at the bottom of the altar on two of the sides. And so that was the process that went on at that particular point in time. Now, I've said all of that, and it's already 1:15, so I want to stop. But I want you to understand that the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, is not an easy book to read. And there are some chapters that are going to be very boring, but you need to persevere because you will draw some good from every chapter. But understand, much of it was written to the Kohanim. Much of it was written for them, but not all of it. So at this point in time, I am going to stop for a second, let you know that we're going to talk about Aaron's inauguration next time. But for this time, any thoughts, any questions, any concerns?